Thanksgiving, a time of warmth, family and gratitude. The table is heavy with food, the air thick with nostalgia. It's a holiday woven into the American identity. The Pilgrims gathered with their new Indigenous allies, celebrating a harvest that promised survival in a strange land. But beneath the roasted turkey and pumpkin pie lies something darker, something far more unsettling. The Pilgrims, who crossed the Atlantic in search of freedom, did not find peace. They found hardship, death, and fear. For these settlers, every misfortune carried the stench of divine wrath. Every strange noise in the night belonged to the devil lurking in the woods. The Puritans followed shortly after, a people obsessed with purity, sin, and punishment, determined to carve a city of God into the unforgiving wilderness. They saw the new world not as a gift, but as a battleground, one where every enemy, every failed crop, and every neighbour who dared to step out of line could be in league with the devil himself. This is not the Thanksgiving story taught in classrooms. Beneath the surface, it is a story of conquest, religious extremism, and violence. It is the tale of settlers who thanked God not just for survival, but for the slaughter of entire communities. It is a legacy shaped by the fear of witches, the need to root out heresy, and the belief that only through blood and suffering could the favour of heaven be won. We'll uncover the violent origins of early Thanksgivings, the witch hunts that gripped the Puritan soul, and the lasting impact of these settlers on America's moral compass. The Pilgrims and Puritans left behind more than traditions. They planted the seeds of fear, zealotry, and persecution. What grew from those seeds still shapes the nation today, lingering in politics, religion, and even the stories we tell ourselves. Thanksgiving's origins, far from simple, are tangled in the darkest corners of history, and those shadows are where we're headed next. In September 1620, the Pilgrims set sail from Plymouth, England, aboard the Mayflower, a ship not built for such a voyage but pressed into service by a desperate faith. Below deck, 102 men, women and children huddled in the stinking darkness, tossed by storms and plagued by sickness. They carried more than trunks and provisions. They carried a belief forged in exile and rejection. In England, the Church of England was law, and defying it was treason. The Pilgrims, separatists as they were known, rejected the authority of both bishops and kings, demanding the right to worship as they saw fit. To King James I, their defiance was more than heresy. It was rebellion. They faced persecution at every turn, imprisonments, fines, and confiscation of property. Their meeting houses were raided, their preachers silenced, and families scattered. Some fled to the Netherlands, hoping to find refuge among the more tolerant Dutch. But their troubles did not end in a foreign land. They found safety, but at a cost. The strange customs of the Dutch began seeping into their children's lives, diluting the identity they had fought so hard to preserve. To stay meant to lose themselves slowly over generations. And so they decided to leave again, this time setting their sights on a new world, a place where they could rebuild their covenant with God from the ground up. The journey across the Atlantic was not the smooth crossing they had prayed for. Storms clawed at the ship, cracking beams and soaking their food supplies with brine. In the middle of one violent squall, John Howland, a young man seeking fortune, was thrown overboard, but luck, or providence, was on his side. He grabbed hold of a trailing rope and was hauled back to safety, shivering, but alive. To those aboard, his survival was no accident. It was a sign that God had not abandoned them. After 66 days adrift, the Mayflower made landfall, not in the fertile lands of Virginia as they had planned, but in the barren cold of Cape Cod. They dropped anchor in November 1620, greeted not by opportunity, but by an unforgiving landscape. The soil was rocky, the forests unfamiliar, and winter was already closing in. Their miscalculation left them stranded, forced to build a settlement on land where no harvest would come soon enough to save them from the cold. The land they occupied had not always been empty. It had been home to the Patuxet people, wiped out by a plague brought by earlier European explorers. The Pilgrims stumbled upon their abandoned villages, fields still partially sown and caches of corn hidden beneath the frost. They took what they could, knowing that every handful of grain might be the difference between life and death. Winter arrived with a vengeance, and sickness spread through the camp like wildfire. William Bradford, who would later lead the colony, described it as a time of misery and death. Disease claimed half their number, men, women and children alike. The first governor, John Carver, succumbed before spring thawed the ground. The dead were buried hastily, and the living counted themselves among the damned, not knowing if they would last to see another sunrise. Only 7 of the original settlers remained healthy enough to care for the dying. Graves were dug at night to hide their losses from any watching eyes. To the survivors, it seemed as though they were being tested. Every death, another trial by God's hand. Yet they endured. Their survival felt like more than chance. To those who remained, it was a covenant fulfilled. God, in his divine wisdom, had led them to this place, cleared the land of its former inhabitants, and ensured that the Pilgrims would inherit it. Each hardship became another thread in the story they told themselves, that they were chosen to suffer, and through suffering, to conquer. The land, they believed, had been prepared for them, just as the promised land had been given to the Israelites. In March 1621, their luck, or fate, shifted. A man named Samoset walked into their camp speaking enough English to communicate. He returned later with Tisquantum, or Squanto, the last of the Patuxet, who had survived capture, slavery and loss, only to return to find his people gone. Squanto, in an act that the Pilgrims would interpret as divine intervention, taught them how to plant corn, fertilize the soil with fish, and trap beavers. Without his guidance, the Pilgrims would not have survived another winter. That autumn, the settlers held a feast of Thanksgiving. They were joined by Massasoit, the sachem of the Wampanoag, and 90 of his men. But even as they celebrated, the alliance between the two groups was uneasy. For Massasoit, this gathering was not an act of friendship, but a strategic decision, an alliance born out of necessity, as he sought to strengthen his position against rival tribes. The Pilgrims, too, knew that survival still hung by a thread. Their gratitude was real, but so was the fear of what lay ahead in a land still full of unknown dangers. The first Thanksgiving is remembered as a moment of peace. It was fleeting. It marked not the end of struggle, but the beginning of something much harder. The Pilgrims had come in search of freedom, but the price of freedom would soon become clear. Survival demanded expansion, and expansion would lead to conflict. Gratitude alone could not build a colony. Something sharper would be needed. The Pilgrims had secured their survival, but the community they built would soon evolve into something far more rigid and expansive. What began as a fragile colony of refugees would, in time, align itself with a stricter, more dogmatic movement: the Puritans. The Pilgrims were separatists, small in number and focused on creating a religious haven for their own congregation. The Puritans, by contrast, were a larger, more organised faction of Protestant reformers. Though both groups despised the Church of England, the Puritans sought not separation but purification, an effort to reform the Anglican Church from within. When the political climate in England worsened, many Puritans fled to the New World, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Led by John Winthrop, they envisioned their colony as a city upon a hill, a model of moral purity and divine favour. By the mid-1630s, these two settlements, Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, had begun working together. Although the Pilgrims of Plymouth remained more tolerant and pragmatic than their Puritan counterparts, the growing presence of Puritan leaders gradually shaped the cultural and political landscape of the region. In time, the two communities shared a common outlook, that they were chosen by God to bring order to the New World, and that any resistance, whether from indigenous peoples or dissenters within their own ranks, was a threat to their divine mission. Expansion became essential, not just for survival, but for dominance. As more Puritan settlers arrived, they pushed inland, establishing towns and claiming land already inhabited by native peoples. Tensions grew, particularly with the Pequot, a powerful tribe that controlled trade along the Connecticut River. Trade disputes, competition over alliances with other tribes, and Puritan demands for land set the stage for conflict. What had begun as small skirmishes escalated into a full-blown war in 1636, when the murder of trader John Oldham, blamed on the Pequot, provoked a swift and brutal response. In May of 1637, the Puritans decided it was time to put an end to the Pequot threat once and for all. They aligned with the Narragansett and Mohegan tribes, who had their own grievances with the Pequot, and prepared for an attack. At dawn on May 26th, Captain John Mason and his men, along with their native allies, surrounded a Pequot village near the Mystic River. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Puritans set the village ablaze, trapping the Pequot inside. As the fire raged, they stood outside the walls, cutting down anyone who tried to escape. By morning, more than 400 Pequot lay dead, men, women, and children alike. The Narragansett, horrified by the slaughter, protested that this was not how warfare was supposed to be waged. But to the Puritans it was divine justice. John Winthrop, governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, later declared a day of thanksgiving, not for peace, but for victory. The smoke rising from Mystic had become, in their minds, a holy incense, evidence that God had judged in their favour. The Puritans saw the massacre not as an atrocity, but as a necessary step toward establishing a godly society in a land they believed had been given to them by divine right. In this new world order, Thanksgiving was no longer a simple harvest celebration. It had become a ritual of power. The land they claimed, the crops they planted, and the houses they built were all sanctified by the blood of their enemies. Peace, they believed, could only be secured through domination. And with each new victory came more reason to give thanks. Thanks not only for what they had, but for what they had taken. Between the Autumn Feast of 1621 and the Massacre at Mystic in 1637, the New England colonies had grown from fragile settlements into expanding territories governed by a theology of conquest. The cooperation between Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay paved the way for future colonial expansion, as both Pilgrims and Puritans embraced a vision of divine destiny. Gratitude was still present, but now it was bound to violence, as victory in war became a sign of divine approval. The massacre at Mystic was a turning point, not just for the Puritans, but for the future of colonial America. Thanksgiving was no longer merely about survival. It was a celebration of conquest. From this point forward, expansion would mean more bloodshed, and each new Thanksgiving would be another chapter in a story written with fire, musket balls, and the unwavering belief that their God demanded nothing less. The Puritans believed that life itself was a trial, a narrow path between salvation and damnation, flanked on all sides by the devil's snares. Every thought, every action, every impulse was weighed in the eyes of God, and missteps invited not just shame, but eternal punishment. To the Puritan mind, sin was not a private flaw. It was a contagion, a spiritual disease that spread through families, communities, and nations. They lived in constant fear that even the smallest transgression could invite divine wrath, bringing famine, illness, or ruin upon them all. Theirs was a theology of terror. God was not only merciful but also vengeful, and his anger could be kindled by pride, deceit, or even joy taken too freely. The Puritans taught that humanity was born in sin, each soul destined for hell unless redeemed through unyielding obedience to God's law. The wilderness around them was more than a landscape. It was the devil's playground, filled with temptation and treachery. Every strange noise from the forest, every storm that rolled across the sky, was a reminder of the battle being fought between heaven and hell. The new world they had entered was no promised land. It was a place where the forces of darkness seemed to gather, waiting to strike. To them, the indigenous peoples, though often allies, were seen through the lens of the fall, souls untouched by Christian redemption, living in what the Puritans considered a state of moral corruption. Even the wild animals seemed suspect. The wilderness teemed with dangers, both physical and spiritual. It was a place where the devil was believed to walk freely, luring the righteous from the path of salvation into darkness. Every aspect of life in the New World became a moral test. A failed crop was not just a misfortune, it was a sign that sin had taken root. A fever in the night could mean more than illness. It could be evidence that someone among them had fallen from grace. Children were especially vulnerable, their young souls easily swayed by vanity, curiosity, or defiance. Parents were warned to watch their offspring closely, lest they unwittingly become tools of the devil. The Puritans lived in fear of God, but they also feared their own weaknesses, believing that Satan sought to use their doubts and desires to lead them astray. For the Puritans, even joy carried a dangerous edge. Laughter, dance, or unguarded pleasure could give the devil a foothold. To survive in this wilderness, to tame it, they needed to be not only industrious but pure. They saw themselves as soldiers in a spiritual war, their settlements outposts of God's kingdom in enemy territory. The wilderness beyond their villages was both literal and symbolic, untamed land and a metaphor for the human soul. Just as the forest needed to be cleared and cultivated, so too did their souls need to be disciplined and purified. Their worldview demanded constant vigilance. This was not just a fight for survival, it was a battle for the eternal fate of their souls. A storm could be more than weather, it could be punishment. A neighbour's misfortune might be a sign of secret sin. Every small act mattered, every choice carried the weight of cosmic consequence. It was not enough to survive, they had to remain blameless, knowing that the devil was always at the door, waiting for a crack in their defences. This fear of sin was not confined to the pulpit. It shaped their laws, their punishments, and their relationships. Civil infractions, missing church, working on the Sabbath, gossip, were not just breaches of social order, they were offences against God himself. Those who transgressed could expect harsh punishments, not only for their own sake, but to cleanse the community as a whole. Public humiliation, fines, and even execution were seen as necessary to protect the colony from divine wrath. Puritan preachers like John Cotton and Increase Mather warned of the dangers of spiritual complacency, reminding their flock that Satan was cunning and relentless. Their sermons painted vivid pictures of hell, a place of eternal fire where sinners would suffer without hope of mercy. They believed that every soul in the community was bound together, and the sins of one could condemn them all. Thus, they were not only responsible for their own salvation, but for the purity of their neighbours. This theology created a society built on suspicion, an uneasy alliance between fear and faith. Everyone watched everyone else, searching for signs of weakness or hidden sin. A misstep could mark you as an outcast, a danger to the community, a gateway through which the devil might enter. This obsession with purity and control turned every day into a reckoning. Life itself became a trial, an endless struggle to remain righteous in a world filled with unseen dangers. And yet, this fear gave the Puritans a kind of power, an unyielding conviction that they were soldiers of light in a world shrouded in darkness. Their faith, though harsh, was a source of strength, binding them together against the unknown. They believed that God was watching, and if they remained pure, he would guide them through every hardship, just as he had brought them to this wilderness. But if they faltered, if sin took hold, his wrath would be swift and unforgiving. It was this constant fear, this relentless battle for purity, that defined their existence. The wilderness around them, the temptation within them, the devil beneath every shadow. These were not abstract fears. They were the air the Puritans breathed, the ground they walked upon, the gospel they preached to their children. And it was only a matter of time before fear turned to suspicion and suspicion to blood. Fear needs fuel, and in 1688, Puritan Boston found a spark in the figure of Bridget Goody Glover. She was an Irish Catholic, foreign in both faith and manner, a woman out of place among the stern Puritan flock. To them, she embodied everything dangerous: outsider blood, foreign prayers, and beliefs that bent away from their rigid creed. In a colony obsessed with purity, she stood as a reminder of the wildness they could not control. Her trouble began when 4 children in the household of John Goodwin, a devout Puritan, fell ill. They became afflicted with strange fits, convulsing, babbling, and contorting their bodies as though something unholy had taken hold of them. The children cried out that Goody Glover had cursed them. Her presence, they claimed, had brought the devil into their home. Their symptoms mirrored those found in English witch trials, cases studied and recited by Puritan ministers. To the people of Boston, these were not illnesses of the body, but attacks upon the soul. Glover was accused of witchcraft, dragged into the public eye, and placed on trial. She spoke little English, stumbling over the language of her accusers. When questioned, she muttered Catholic prayers, familiar to her but incomprehensible to the Puritans. The people of Boston saw her prayers not as pleas to God, but as dark incantations. It confirmed what they had suspected all along. She was in league with the devil. At trial, Glover admitted that she had quarrelled with the Goodwin children, but she insisted she had harmed no one. It did not matter. Cotton Mather, one of the most influential Puritan ministers of the time, attended the trial and later wrote that Glover's soul belonged to a company of demons. Her Catholicism made her alien, her Irishness made her suspect, and her defiance sealed her fate. She was guilty, not just in their courts, but in their theology. The devil, it seemed, had found a voice in Boston, and it spoke with an Irish accent. She was sentenced to death by hanging. On the day of her execution, Glover stood unrepentant, clutching a small doll, what the Puritans believed to be a tool of dark magic. Her refusal to confess her sins only deepened their conviction that she was lost beyond redemption, a servant of hell. In the end, she died not just as a witch in their eyes, but as a warning, a reminder that the devil's influence could take root anywhere, especially among outsiders. But even her death did not soothe the colony's nerves. The children's afflictions continued, undeterred by Glover's execution. To the Puritans, it meant only one thing: the devil's grip on the colony had not been broken. Glover's trial was merely the beginning. The threat of witchcraft, of evil disguised in familiar faces, would continue to fester in the minds of the faithful. Suspicion lingered in every street and home, spreading quietly, like frost creeping beneath the floorboards. In hindsight, the trial of Goody Glover stands as a precursor to what would erupt 4 years later in Salem. Her story revealed the deep fault lines in Puritan society, the growing fear of outsiders, the terror of the unknown, and the ease with which the community could turn on those who didn't belong. Glover's trial was a signal that the Puritans had grown uneasy, that their need for control had outstripped their grasp on reason. They had cast Goody Glover into the role of a scapegoat, but her death was not enough. The fear she embodied, the fear of the other, the foreign, the uncontrolled, would only grow, and soon it would reach a fever pitch. What began with a Catholic woman muttering prayers in a broken accent would end with gallows creaking beneath Salem's grey skies. By 1692, fear had taken root deep within the soil of New England, spreading like ivy through Puritan minds. The trial of Goody Glover had been a warning. The devil's servants were among them, disguised in plain sight, using their unholy powers to corrupt the faithful. But what started as suspicion soon became wildfire. In the isolated village of Salem, paranoia blossomed into hysteria, and the flames of that hysteria consumed everything in their path. It began quietly, as most calamities do. In the dead of winter, 2 young girls, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, fell ill in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the town's minister. They writhed and screamed, their bodies twisting unnaturally. No doctor could explain it. When pressed, the girls named names: Taituba, the enslaved woman who served the Paris household; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had long been a subject of gossip. In the minds of the villagers, it was not fever or madness, it was witchcraft, and the devil had slipped through their doors. The accusation spread faster than any illness, feeding on fear and envy. To name a witch was to cast off suspicion from yourself. It wasn't long before dozens of villagers stood accused of pacts with the devil, serving him by poisoning livestock, cursing children, and bringing ruin to the community. Husbands named wives, neighbours turned on neighbours, and children cried out against their elders. To the afflicted, every misfortune became evidence: an unchurned batch of butter, a cow gone dry, a child taken by fever. The trials themselves were theatre, a grim performance of religious extremism dressed in the language of law. Judges relied on spectral evidence, the alleged visions of spirits sent by the accused to torment the living. The afflicted girls screamed in court, writhing on the floor, claiming to see invisible claws and demons sent by the witches standing before them. Their testimony carried more weight than reason. When Tituba confessed under duress, telling wild tales of witches' sabbaths and dark conspiracies, the villagers' worst fears were confirmed. The devil was in their midst. The noose was swift. Bridget Bishop, the first to be tried and convicted, was hanged that June. By September, 19 more had followed her to the gallows, their bodies left dangling as warnings to those who dared stray from the righteous path. Giles Corey, an elderly farmer, was pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. His last words, "more weight," would echo through history as a defiant rejection of the madness overtaking the town. The community tore itself apart. Accusations crossed every boundary: class, family, friendship. Those who confessed were spared, their lives bought at the cost of their integrity. Those who refused to confess, insisting on their innocence, were condemned. Fear ruled Salem, and the price for resisting that fear was death. Rebecca Nurse, a respected elderly woman, was hanged despite widespread pleas for her innocence. Even children weren't safe. Dorcas Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, was imprisoned, her tiny wrists bound in iron. By the time the hysteria burned itself out, 25 people had died. 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, and at least 5 more perishing in jail. The executions ceased, not because the trials had uncovered the truth, but because the frenzy had become too great even for the Puritans to bear. Leaders like Increase Mather and Governor Phipps intervened, condemning the reliance on spectral evidence and halting the executions. But the damage had been done. Salem had consumed itself, and the smoke of fear lingered long after the last noose fell slack. The Salem Witch Trials were not a tale of witches. They were a tale of fear, of a people so terrified of the unknown, so desperate to remain pure, that they devoured their own. The trials revealed the dark heart of Puritan society, a place where faith and paranoia mingled freely, where the need for control trumped compassion, and where superstition wore the robes of justice. Salem's ghosts still linger. Its name is spoken not as a place, but as a warning, a reminder of how fear, unchecked, can become a monster that consumes everything in its path. For the Puritans, the devil was always near, waiting to corrupt their souls. But in Salem, it wasn't the devil who brought ruin. It was fear, dressed in the black and white certainty of righteousness. For the Puritans, the earth was not neutral ground. Every seed planted, every drop of rain that failed to fall, carried the weight of divine judgment. If the fields withered or the livestock fell sick, it was not chance, but consequence. The Puritans believed that the land itself was a reflection of their faith. Obedience would yield bounty, but sin would bring famine. And if the crops refused to grow, if the skies withheld rain, then something or someone was to blame. Strange weather wasn't merely a shift in the wind, it was a message from heaven. A late frost could signal God's displeasure. A swarm of locusts might whisper of unconfessed sin. The Puritans feared what they could not control. And in this new world, wild, untamed and unpredictable, misfortune was constant. Every failing harvest, every spoiled crop was a whisper that the devil might be close at hand. And so, when the cornfields failed to yield or cattle dropped dead, suspicion fell not on the soil but on the souls within the community. It was often the most vulnerable who became the scapegoats, those on the fringes already out of favour. An old widow with a sharp tongue, a woman living alone, a beggar at the edge of town. Anyone who did not fit the mould of Puritan propriety became a likely suspect. The devil, it was believed, didn't arrive with horns and fire but wore ordinary faces, slipping quietly into the hearts of those too weak to resist him. These witches became convenient explanations for every misfortune. The milk that soured, the bread that would not rise, the field overrun with blight. Disease was no different. A plague that swept through the village or a child's sudden death in the night could not be accepted as natural tragedy. These were not accidents, they were warnings. Illness, too, was tied to sin, a divine reminder that the wages of transgression were suffering and death. Physicians and ministers alike sought spiritual causes for ailments, suspecting that the devil might be working through invisible hands. Stories abounded of bewitched crops and cursed livestock, tales told by the firelight in hushed tones. A farmer's cow, once healthy, would stop giving milk after a neighbour's quarrel. A garden would wither after the gardener refused a beggar's plea for bread. These incidents were not coincidences, but signs, and the community responded with swift suspicion. If misfortune struck, someone had to pay. In 1648, Margaret Jones of Charlestown, Massachusetts, was hanged after being accused of practicing witchcraft through medicine. She had offered herbal remedies to the sick, but when her patients did not recover, the community believed it was not illness she treated, but curses she spread. Jones was the first person executed for witchcraft in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a grim precedent that would echo through the years, leading all the way to Salem's gallows. The devil's presence, they believed, could be traced in the smallest misfortunes. If the wheat sprouted weak or the river overflowed its banks, the Puritans asked not why, but who. Every failure in the fields, every illness in the home was a spiritual crisis, a warning that sin was festering among them, or worse, that the devil had slipped unnoticed into the community. And so the search for witches continued, fueled by fear of the unknown and the need to make sense of suffering. Witchcraft, they thought, offered a simple answer to complex problems. It gave shape to the formless dread that hung over every field and home. The devil, lurking just out of sight, provided an explanation that was far easier to grasp than the uncertainty of nature or the frailty of human life. It was easier to believe that a neighbour had bewitched your crops than to accept that life was fragile and the world was indifferent. And so, with each failed harvest, the circle of suspicion grew tighter. The Puritans knew that their survival depended on the land, but more than that, they believed that the land's fruitfulness depended on their purity. Their fields were battlegrounds where the forces of good and evil fought in every sprouting seed. And when those fields failed, it could only mean one thing. Someone had opened the door to the devil. This belief in cursed crops and bewitched cattle gave the Puritans a grim kind of clarity. If God's blessings were earned through obedience, then misfortune must be punished until the balance was restored. Someone's sin was always to blame, and if that someone couldn't be found, the rot would only spread. Fear turned into fervour, and fervour into persecution. Better, they thought, to hang an innocent woman than risk the wrath of heaven falling upon them all. In the summer of 1656, more than 3 decades before Salem's hysteria would take hold, the Puritan colony of Boston condemned Anne Hibbins to death for witchcraft. But hers was not the kind of trial whispered about, with possessed children writhing on floors or cows bewitched into barrenness. No strange apparitions testified against her, no ominous weather marked her downfall. Anne Hibbins' crime was far simpler. She did not conform. Widowed and wealthy, Anne Hibbins was by all accounts an outspoken woman. Her husband, William Hibbins, had been a prosperous merchant and a magistrate, a man of status in the colony. But after his death, Anne's fortunes changed. Without her husband to shield her, she was exposed. Her sharp words and unyielding spirit, once tolerated in a respectable wife, now cast her as a threat. She quarrelled with neighbours and builders she had hired, refusing to yield to men she found incompetent. In a society that demanded submission from women, her defiance was unforgivable. The Puritans prized harmony, but Anne Hibbins was a discordant note, a woman who spoke her mind in a community that demanded silence. When disputes arose, she didn't bite her tongue, and her sharp tongue quickly became a subject of gossip. The men in power labelled her difficult, a troublemaker, a woman who dared to live without apology. It wasn't long before whispers began to spread. Perhaps her defiance came from darker forces. Perhaps the devil had taken up residence beneath her skin. In 1656, those whispers took form. She was accused of witchcraft. No spectral evidence, no strange fits, only the weight of her defiance pressed against her. The accusation itself was thin, but it didn't matter. The community had decided. Anne Hibbins was guilty, not of spells or sorcery, but of refusing to submit. And in a society where obedience was salvation, defiance was enough to damn her. Anne Hibbins was found guilty and sentenced to hang. Her wealth, her late husband's reputation, none of it could save her. She went to the gallows on the outskirts of Boston, joining the ranks of those whose only crime was standing apart. There were no screams of the possessed, no haunted visions, just a quiet certainty that a woman who did not fit could not be allowed to stay. Her trial became a warning, a story told with a shiver. This is what happens to those who do not bend. Anne Hibbins was not a witch, but she was a woman who lived on her own terms. And in Puritan Boston, that was dangerous enough. Her execution became part of the colony's folklore, a reminder that the devil need not arrive with fire and brimstone. Sometimes, he wore the face of a woman who dared to say no. Her death, quiet but significant, was an early thread in the fabric of suspicion that would unravel so violently in 1692. The fear of witches was never just about sorcery, it was about control. It was about rooting out anything or anyone that could disrupt the fragile order of their God-fearing society. And Anne Hibbins, with her sharp tongue and independent spirit, had been too much disorder for Puritan Boston to bear. Her name was buried alongside her body, but her ghost lingered. Anne Hibbins became a symbol, a reminder of how easily the line between sinner and witch could blur, and how quickly those on the outside could find themselves at the gallows. The Puritans are long gone, but their ghost still lingers, woven into the very bones of American society. They left behind more than settlements or sermons. They left behind a way of thinking, a worldview built on strict moral codes, suspicion and fear. Though the gallows of Salem are silent now, their legacy endures, shaping the nation's politics, culture and law. In Puritan New England, life was lived on the razor's edge of judgment. God watched every deed, measured every thought, and the price for falling short was ruin, both in this world and the next. This moral absolutism, the belief that every action was either righteous or sinful, became more than just theology. It became a foundation for how communities governed themselves. Sin wasn't just a private matter, it was a public danger threatening to invite divine punishment on everyone. The law, therefore, became a tool to root out not just crime, but wickedness, punishing those who strayed from the narrow path. That need for purity has never quite left America's bloodstream. The Puritans divided the world into two camps, the righteous and the damned, insiders and outsiders. Those who conformed were part of the community, bound together in a shared covenant with God. But anyone who lived differently, anyone who didn't fit, was viewed not just with suspicion, but with fear. The same fear that condemned Anne Hibbins and Goody Glover still echoes in the cultural instinct to demonize the outsider. Immigrants, dissidents, anyone who doesn't conform to the dominant moral code, they have long been cast in the same light as witches and heretics, their difference perceived as a threat to the community's safety. This tendency to scapegoat outsiders has shaped American history from the very beginning. The Puritans' isolationism, Their belief that they were chosen by God to remain separate from the corrupt world laid the groundwork for a cultural distrust of the other. Waves of religious revivals, from the Great Awakenings to more recent movements, have echoed Puritan ideals, framing morality as a battlefield and painting those outside the dominant group as enemies of the righteous. In politics, the legacy of Puritan moral absolutism lives on in the rhetoric of black and white thinking, where opponents are not just wrong, but morally corrupt. Policies are often justified with the same zeal the Puritans used to explain crop failures and plagues, disasters framed as evidence of God's displeasure. Even now, laws and regulations reflect the lingering belief that sin must be punished not only by God, but by society. The Puritans may be gone, but the idea that the wicked should be cast out, that evil must be purged for the good of the community, remains deeply rooted. American culture still reflects this craving for moral clarity. Public scandals are treated like modern-day witch trials, with figures paraded through media storms, judged not just for their actions, but for what they symbolize. Repentance may bring forgiveness, but those who refuse to conform are exiled, cast out, cancelled, condemned. The impulse to protect the purity of the group, to rid society of those who threaten its moral foundation, runs just as deep today as it did in 17th century Boston. And then there's the fear. Fear of divine punishment, fear of contamination, fear that something unseen might unravel everything. The Puritans believed that sin could spread like rot, corrupting everything it touched, and that belief still resonates. From immigration laws designed to control who belongs, to political rhetoric that paints opponents as existential threats, the same old fear endures. The battle between good and evil is never far from the surface. America's laws, too, bear the fingerprints of Puritan theology. From blue laws regulating behavior on Sundays to the obsession with punishment as a form of moral correction, the legal system reflects a worldview that demands accountability for sin. Prisons in America are not just places of confinement. They are institutions rooted in the idea of moral reform, a secular echo of the Puritan belief that transgressors must be corrected through suffering. The nation's high incarceration rates, the harshness of its sentences, the punitive nature of its policies, all reflect a legacy of control born from the fear of sin. And yet, the Puritans' obsession with morality also gave rise to something uniquely American, a belief in the power of the individual to stand against corruption. For every witch hunt, there have been moments of resistance. Those who refused to bend, who challenged unjust laws, who stood as witnesses to the danger of moral extremism. The same fervour that burned witches at the stake also forged a spirit of defiance, a willingness to question authority, to challenge systems that demand conformity at all costs. The Puritan legacy is a double-edged sword. On one side, the fear of outsiders and obsession with control. On the other, the belief that the individual must remain vigilant against tyranny. These contradictions shape the soul of the nation, creating a culture that swings between moral rigidity and rebellious independence. The ghosts of the Puritans still haunt the nation's courtrooms, its churches, its politics. Their vision of a pure and righteous society lives on, casting shadows over laws and lives. And beneath every call for justice, every demand for accountability, there lingers the quiet hum of fear, a fear born in the wilderness of New England, where every misstep could bring disaster and every stranger might be the devil in disguise. The Puritan mind clings tight to America's soul, a lingering presence that shapes the way power is wielded and punishment is justified. Though the gallows have long since rotted, the impulse to control, through fear, through authority, through punishment, remains as sharp as ever. Religion, too, still bears the stamp of Puritanism, particularly in the way some American denominations wield shame and punishment as tools for control. Evangelical movements preach a gospel of moral absolutism, reviving the Puritan idea that sin must be rooted out at all costs. Hellfire sermons may have given way to modern rhetoric, but the message remains the same. Salvation is earned through obedience, and those who stray must be brought back in line or cast out. The Puritan obsession with moral conformity also bleeds into education and policy, where debates over what is taught reflect a lingering desire to guard the community's purity. Public campaigns against books, art, and lifestyles deemed immoral echo the same fear that once fueled witch trials and public executions. Whether the enemy is a novel, a film, or a way of life, the battle remains familiar. An old war against imagined deviance fought in new arenas. The Puritans' shadow stretches long, not because their laws survived, but because their way of thinking did. The belief that moral authority must be absolute, that sin, once identified, must be punished, still underpins much of American life. Authority is revered, punishment is celebrated, and those who live outside the lines are treated not with curiosity, but with suspicion. The methods may have changed, but the impulse remains the same. To protect the community by casting out the sinner, to enforce conformity through fear. And so the Puritan legacy endures, not just in churches and courtrooms, but in the very way Americans define right and wrong. The devil may no longer walk through the woods, but he still haunts the nation's imagination, lurking indifference, waiting to be named, blamed, and banished. Authority demands obedience. Punishment promises redemption, and fear, ever present, ever hungry, keeps the boundaries tight and the outsiders at bay. America inherited more than laws and doctrines from the Puritans. It inherited a worldview shaped by fear, rooted in the belief that salvation can only be secured through control. And as long as fear rules the heart, the Puritans will never truly leave. They'll remain in every law that punishes the weak, in every policy that divides the world into good and evil, and in every whispered warning that there are monsters waiting just outside the gates. The Puritan fear of sin and isolation, of hidden devils and divine punishment, has never truly faded. It only found new forms. These old fears have slipped quietly into the world of modern horror, where they thrive, woven into stories that feel both ancient and disturbingly familiar. The horrors of Puritanism live on, not just in sermons or laws, but in the flicker of a film reel, in the pages of books, and in every whisper of the supernatural that haunts our imagination. Few films capture this legacy more clearly than Robert Eggers' The Witch, 2015. Set in a remote 17th century New England homestead, the film conjures the Puritans' worst fears. An isolated family stranded on the edge of the wilderness, slowly unravelling under the weight of suspicion and guilt. The story plays out like a Puritan fever dream, where every shadow holds a threat and every misfortune feels like divine retribution. The family's crops wither, their livestock sickens, and their youngest son disappears into the woods. These events aren't mere accidents, they carry the stench of sin. The father's pride, the mother's bitterness, the daughter's blooming adolescence. Every flaw invites ruin, and the devil waits patiently just beyond the tree line. In The Witch, the family fractures under the strain of their rigid beliefs until madness consumes them. The film's brilliance lies in its ambiguity. Is there truly a witch lurking in the woods, or does the family's own fear conjure their destruction? Either way, the message is the same. Belief in absolute purity is a dangerous thing. The very rules that are meant to protect them become the instruments of their undoing. It is the story of Puritanism itself, a lesson in how the battle for salvation can tear a soul apart. Another work that captures the essence of Puritan fear is The Crucible, Arthur Miller's 1953 play, later adapted into film. Though it was written during the McCarthy era, The Crucible uses the Salem Witch Trials as a metaphor for the dangers of moral panic and the relentless pursuit of purity. In Salem, the community's obsession with rooting out evil consumes everyone in its path. Accusations multiply, innocence offers no protection, and those who cling to the truth are crushed beneath the weight of lies. The story mirrors not only the hysteria of 17th century Salem, but also the Puritan impulse to destroy anything that threatens the collective sense of righteousness. In the end, The Crucible shows that the real monster isn't witchcraft, it's fear, masquerading as virtue. M. Night Shyamalan's The Village, 2004, offers a modern twist on these same themes. Though the film takes place in a seemingly idyllic 19th century village, it is built on a Puritan foundation. Fear of the outside world, strict moral codes, and control through terror. The elders keep their people isolated, feeding them stories of monsters in the woods to keep them from straying beyond the village's borders. In the village, the monsters are a lie, but the fear they inspire is very real, just as real as the Puritans' belief that every danger outside their gates was a test sent by God or a snare set by the devil. Shyamalan's film exposes how tightly fear and control are intertwined, showing that sometimes the greatest horror lies not in the things we fear but in the lengths we go to protect ourselves from them. These stories resonate because they tap into something deeply rooted in the human psyche, the tension between order and chaos, between belief and doubt. They reflect the psychological horror of Puritanism, where rigid belief systems clash with the uncontrollable forces of nature, desire, and the unknown. For the Puritans, life was a battle against unseen enemies, sin, the devil, and the wilderness itself. In horror films, this battle plays out again and again, showing how those who cling too tightly to control are often the first to fall. The Puritan obsession with purity and fear of the outsider isn't just a historical artifact, it's a recurring motif in horror. In these stories, the rules are always clear, the lines between good and evil sharply drawn. But the horror lies in the grey areas, the places where certainty slips, where righteousness falters, where the things we fear most turn out to be part of ourselves. Whether it's a family destroyed by fear in The Witch, a town consumed by lies in The Crucible, or a village trapped by its own myths in The Village, these stories show that the real danger isn't just the thing outside the gates. It's the fear that we carry inside, the need to control what cannot be controlled, the terror that purity might never be enough. The monsters in these narratives aren't witches or demons. They are belief systems taken to their breaking point, fears given too much power, and communities that turn against themselves in the search for safety. And like the Puritans, the characters in these stories often discover the truth too late, that the things we try to banish, the doubts, the desires, the fears, have a way of slipping back in no matter how tightly we lock the doors. Even outside the horror genre, characters and themes echo the Puritan obsession with control and punishment. From the cult-like communities of The Handmaid's Tale to the religious zealotry in Midnight Mass, the same questions linger. What is the cost of purity? And who pays the price when fear takes hold? But these stories do more than scare us. They also hold up a mirror. They remind us that the fear of sin, the obsession with purity, and the hatred of outsiders are not relics of the past. They are part of the human condition, buried deep within our collective psyche. And like the Puritans, we are still searching for ways to make sense of the chaos, still trying to draw neat lines between good and evil, still looking for someone to blame when things go wrong. There is a reason these themes continue to captivate modern audiences. In a world that feels uncertain and unstable, there is comfort in the idea that rules can bring order, that if we follow the right path we will be safe. But horror reminds us that control is an illusion. The things we fear cannot be locked out, no matter how tightly we shut the doors. And the harder we cling to our beliefs, the more likely we are to destroy ourselves from within. The fascination with Puritanism endures because it tells a story we still need to hear. A story about fear, control, and the monsters that live both outside and within. The real horror is not the unknown. It's what we do to each other in the name of righteousness. The legacy of the Pilgrims and Puritans is not one of simple gratitude, but one haunted by darker forces. Their religious extremism, born from fear of divine wrath, created a world ruled by control, suspicion, and violence. Theirs was a faith sharpened by the wilderness, one that demanded purity at all costs and saw evil in every shadow. They waged wars in the name of God, slaughtered those who stood in their way, and hanged their neighbours out of fear that the devil had slipped among them. These old fears are not relics, they are echoes that still shape the American soul. the obsession with punishment, the fear of outsiders, the belief that morality can be enforced through control. These patterns persist, woven into the fabric of politics, religion, and culture. Each November, Thanksgiving returns, framed as a time for gratitude. But beneath the turkey and pie, the holiday carries the weight of a more complex history. It remembers not only survival, but also conquest. It tells a story of faith and the fear that comes with it. Thanksgiving's legacy is one of paradox. It celebrates kindness, yet it was born from violence. It asks for gratitude even as it carries the burden of fanaticism. The ghosts of the past still linger, reminding us that the line between righteousness and ruin is thinner than we'd like to believe. And so, every year, as the table is set and the candles lit, we honor not just a harvest, but the uneasy truth that fear, like faith, never truly leaves. It waits just beneath the surface, haunting us still.